Anti-vaccine movements are nothing new.
Mm.
But more fundamentally, what's not new is the way in which the child becomes this symbol of purity and vulnerability. And that takes on a special power with autism because of the coincidental link between the age at which autism emerges and
Right.
when the majority of the vaccines are given. That relationship is coincidental, not causal, but it looks causal to people because it happens
Right.
at the same time. And so you see these things happening over and over again in history. And I don't want to say this is just old wine in new bottles, but to some extent, we've seen this story before if you look back in history.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. There is so much news happening all the time, and particularly so many things that the president does that are hard to kind of keep track of or catch up to. And one of those things for me was that he had a just completely unhinged, appalling, ludicrous, dangerous event at the White House. I guess it was like a week, maybe 2 weeks ago. I think it was a week ago. I think it was on Monday when I didn't have a show that night. In which he announced some big new finding that Tylenol taken by pregnant women was responsible for the rise that we've seen in autism diagnoses, and that heretofore you shouldn't take Tylenol if you're a pregnant woman, and you have to, quote, tough it out, in the words of Trump. And he said all sorts of other crazy things, that there's too much liquid going into the babies, like the amount of liquid in the vaccines was excessive. The whole thing was just really appalling. I'll get to what was wrong about all this, sort of in terms of what the literature and science suggests. But part of what was also strange is there has been for a very long time a false and specious story told by people opposed to vaccination that vaccination, infant vaccination particularly, causes autism. That has been thoroughly debunked. It is not true. The paper in the Lancet Medical Journal that originally sparked this, to the extent it had a spark, was withdrawn. There were sanctions for the individual who authored it. It was completely methodologically unsound, etc. But I always thought that the autism vaccine story was about vaccines, insofar as this was a reason vaccines were bad. But one of the things that's been very strange to me about watching the development of the perversion of the public health system under RFK is the obsession with autism. So it's like it's on both ends, and that autism is this like creeping specter that's, this society is awash in it. And when RFK talks about it, he talks about these kids are never going to have a life. They're never going to go to a baseball game, and just in these really like profoundly kind of derogatory ways that I have to say, with a lot of people who have various autism diagnoses that are close to me in my life, many of these people don't react great to the rhetoric that is emanated from the White House. But it has become this strange kind of obsession and this kind of cultural touchstone. And I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit, because we've talked a lot about the vaccine part of it, particularly with Dr. Peter Hotez. But the fact that this event wasn't about vaccines per se, but about getting to they were going to solve the mystery of whence this enormous explosion in autism diagnoses. And here was the great unveiling. And so I'm really happy today to have with me Professor Richard Drinker. He's a cultural anthropologist. He's director of the George Washington University Institute for Ethnographic Research. He's written a number of books, including Unstrange Minds, Remapping the World of Autism. And he caught my eye with an op-ed that he wrote just the other day after this event. Autism has always existed. We haven't always called it autism. So Dr. Drinker, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let me start by just doing some housekeeping for the sake of what we might call epistemic hygiene, which is like, is it true that there's some causal connection between pregnant women taking Tylenol and autism? What does the data say about that?
Well, I don't know anything that is unknown to anybody who reads the pieces that showed a positive correlation. And I'm not a basic scientist, I'm a social scientist. But the literature is replete with associations of things that cause things that seem to be connected to each other, but aren't causal. On my campus, we frequently have little fires that break out because students are not very good at cooking in their dorms. And there are always firemen there next to the fires. And so one can say, well, there's an association here that wherever there's a fire, there are firemen. But we know that firemen aren't causing the fires, right? The classic example is the ice cream and crime example. They both increase in the summer. It doesn't mean that one causes the other. And those kinds of association studies are incredibly important because they help you to generate new hypotheses to do research. But in and of themselves, they don't establish a causal link.
How did you first come to get interested in autism as a subject of research? Your background is in cultural anthropology. Your earlier research wasn't necessarily on this topic. How did you find your way to the topic?
Well, there's sort of two strands that came together. The first one is that I was raised in a family of mental health professionals. My great-grandfather was a psychiatrist. My grandfather was a psychiatrist who was trained by Sigmund Freud. My father was a psychiatrist. And they always instilled in me this idea that there was something that people weren't appreciating about mental health. And what they weren't appreciating about mental health was how much it gets stigmatized and how much we have to find a way to make people, in Freud's language, from being miserable to normally unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's one of my favorite phrases. I use it all the time, actually.
And it's not about curing. Nobody in my family ever talked about curing mental illnesses. They were talking about making the world a better place for people who have mental illnesses, including military, for example. And my grandfather was a very staunch advocate for the military. He was in the military himself, running psychiatric operations in North Africa during World War II. And he said, these are not abnormal men who are in the psychiatric hospital. These are normal men in abnormal circumstances. And we've got to care for them. And so one of the things that I had long been interested in ever since I was a child was understanding the complexities of mental health and particularly brain disorders because the brain is so complex. So that's just one strand. The second strand in my life was in 1994 when we realized something wasn't going well with my daughter. She wasn't responding to us. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't responding to her name. And we brought her to Johns Hopkins University where she was diagnosed with a very unwieldy name, PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, that people used to use, particularly when they were frightened about using the word autism. And so we got this diagnosis. So you've got a dad, me, who is at once both a dad of a child with autism and a cultural anthropologist. And all my friends, all my colleagues are saying, well, since you're both of these things, you must know about autism in China or Japan or Bolivia or Fiji. And I was like, no, I don't know. I'm just a dad. And a cultural anthropologist doesn't know everything about every place in the world, right? And so I started to look for literature and I found that we knew almost nothing about autism outside of North America and Western Europe. I mean, we still don't have good prevalence data from India or China or sub-Saharan Africa. We have good data from South Korea, where I did the biggest study, the first epidemiologic study. There's some good data from Japan. The data, even in the U.S., are not all that great. So we really are still kind of finding our way in terms of understanding how autism varies across space, but also across time.
There's a question that you say your undergraduates ask you in the op-ed you wrote for your Times, which is something like, when did autism become a thing? And it is, I think, a front of mind question for people. I think a lot of people say, yeah, it does seem like when I was younger or 30 years ago that I had heard the word, but it seemed relatively rare. Now it seems much more common, much more prevalent. It it also seems a little more conceptually developed. There's the notion of being on the spectrum. There's a whole kind of like cultural language around it and a cultural vocabulary. There are even jokes about it. Sometimes I think in-group jokes of people who are on the spectrum and have a kind of like, self-aware teasing about it. There's a whole vocab around it that wasn't present when I was 10 years old, say, or 11 years old. So give us a little history of this diagnosis, when it became a thing and how we've kind of come to understand it.
Well, the signs of autism are evident in recorded history. Even Linnaeus, back in the middle of the 14th century, included certain forms of difference that kind of sound like autism in his classification of humans. There are stories throughout the 16th century, the 17th, the 18th century of feral children who people assumed were being raised by wolves. Somebody would just see a kid in the forest and they were dirty and they couldn't talk, and it was assumed they were raised by wolves. In fact, about 100 of these stories are pretty well documented, about 75 boys and 30 girls, which is not that far off from what the ratio is of boys to girls with autism. These were likely children who had what we would today call autism, abandoned by their parents because they were not developing properly. They're found a few days later, hungry and dirty in the woods somewhere, and it's assumed they were raised by wolves. So autism as we know it today, the thing that word describes, is not new. What has happened is that we've created a language to describe how certain kinds of features are grouped together, and they co-occur. We often see difficulties in language development, social communication, difficulties with stereotyped and repetitive behaviors co-occur. And so scholars, scientists came up with the term autism to capture it. Now, they didn't come up with that term first to characterize what we think of today as autism. It was first referring to schizophrenia. Autism was mostly an adjective, autistic, referring to people with schizophrenia who are absorbed by their own thoughts and interests. And then only later in the mid-20th century did we see doctors starting to say, maybe there's something else. Maybe these kids don't have schizophrenia because when they grow up, they don't have the same kind of trajectory as people with schizophrenia. And so autism became associated with a new set of symptoms that were separated from psychosis. Now, I could go on and on about the dynamics and the many differences, but you could do the same with a lot of illnesses. I mean, I have mildly high blood pressure and I take a medicine for it. In 1970, there's no way I would have ever been diagnosed with high blood pressure because the threshold was just so high to get any kind of determination from a clinician like that. And so whether we're talking about autism or whether we're talking about anything else, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, these are frameworks that people develop to try to make sense of something that is a problem or a risk factor or something that clinicians have decided warrants treatment.
I mean, this gets to this very profound question, right, about what diagnostics are, whether you're cleaving the world at its joints, how arbitrary or contingently constructed as a product of a specific time and place, or how sort of universal, how much it's naming a thing out in the world, right? We have, like, if you look at the history of tuberculosis, like, we know that consumption was happening in different places at different times. It had different names. We can now say, okay, that's the same thing. It's the same microorganism doing the same thing in these in the body. And I think with autism, I guess my feeling about it, again, as a sort of layperson who follows it, of like, are we talking about something that's in the world with some defined biological substrate? Or is it like, I don't know, like at a certain point, being gay was in the DSM and then it was out of being in the DSM, and gender dysphoria was not in the diagnostic manual and then it was in the diagnostic manual. So like, this is a difficult question to ask, of just like, how much do we think of this as something with a very clear and defined biological substrate and something as a a category and concept that we're sort of throwing around a bunch of characteristics people may manifest?
Yeah, you are asking a very complicated question.
Yeah.
and and I don't think it's fair to say that when we conceptualize, say, a mental illness or a developmental disorder, that it's fundamentally different from the way we conceptualize other illnesses.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you can find
Yeah.
a virus, even if you can find a bacterium, that doesn't tell you about the different range of presentations, severity, and so on. All kinds of medical syndromes have very different ways of being, right?
Yeah.
So why do we come up with these classifications? We have to classify. We've got to come up with them. We have to have labels. We have to have labels to be able to understand something, and also to be able to know when there is that point that someone needs help. So a lot of people get diagnosed today with something because it drives a service, right? So the psychiatrist Judy Rappaport, one of the most important child psychiatrists of the last 75 years, she was talking to me once about how rigorous her research was. And she said, that's my research. But in my private practice where I see kids, I'll call a kid a zebra if that gets him into the classroom that's right for him.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine that you're back in 1970, where thousands of kids in any city are being denied an education. In 1973, about 12 to 13,000 kids a year in Washington, D.C. were not given an education because there was no special education infrastructure. So do those kids have a diagnosis? They don't. They don't have a diagnosis of anything.
And they're just not being given an education because it's like they're uneducable, or
the school didn't have the resources
right,
to do it.
We can't do it.
Right. And even when they were included in schools, they were called things like educable mentally retarded, or emotionally blocked, or any other term a school wanted to use. There was no uniform set of terms throughout the country. And autism was a pretty rarely used term. You know, if you were to go back in school records in the early 1970s, you're not going to find many cases of autism at all because schools didn't use it. So flash forward to 2006, where my colleagues and I start this huge epidemiologic study in South Korea. It's similar. There's not a lot of autism in the records, very little. It looks like it doesn't exist. We do a 5 to 6 year study and we find a prevalence of 2.64%, the highest ever recorded in the world at that time, which is 2011. And it wasn't like we made it up, or we, went and diagnosed kids with autism who would never have been diagnosed without whatever kind of method we used. They didn't have a diagnosis because the word didn't have meaning yet in South Korea.
I mean, this gets to the sort of profound question here, right? That like when RFK says like autism rates have gone through the roof or diagnoses have gone up, and you can look at a chart and they've gone up, right? It's like, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about naming a thing that's been there and unnamed,
right,
such that people can find pathways towards living, flourishing, fulfilling lives, because giving it a name is the thing that facilitates and enables the kinds of interactions and resources that will aid that? Are we talking about some kind of social contagion or some kind of moral panic? I mean, there are periods, right, where we go through and we say like, all these women are possessed with witches, right? There's periods where there's this sort of sense of, oh, there's this thing going on. And there's been other, versions of that. What is it seems to me that clearly the thing driving the numbers up is the naming of a thing that was not being noticed or named before. Is that broadly true?
And the definition is different. Just like I have hypertension now, but I wouldn't have had it years ago.
It's expanded.
Right? It's expanded enormously. I mean, autism has almost become, to some people think it's almost meaningless because it includes people who are at the highest levels of government and scholarship, and people who are, need 24/7 care. But I want to draw your attention to something else, Chris, which is that in order to make a diagnosis, someone's got to do it. So who does it? Somebody has to see it and name it. Well, in 1970, there were 400 child psychiatrists in the United States. Child psychiatry barely existed. In 2005, there were 7,400 child psychiatrists. In 2025 rather, there are nearly 12,000 child psychiatrists. So you have a big infrastructure now of child mental health. And that then drives diagnoses, it drives new services, and the new services require more diagnoses, and it
Right.
gets into this kind of feedback loop.
Right. But that also starts to sound like a kind of sort of industrial complex, you know? I mean, like, there's a little bit of, if you came to my house every day with a plumber to inspect whether the plumbing's wrong,
Eventually you'll find something.
yeah, like I would end up with someone being like, you got to fix this. And that's very different than like, oh my God, my sink is leaking. Right. So there is a little bit there. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, some part of me is like, is that kind of what's happening here a little bit? That there's more of a structure around this. It unlocks other resources, and those resources are useful in certain ways. Or there's a way that parents are dealing with feeling like something isn't right with their kid, and this puts a name to it. And maybe the answer is like, yes, all of that's true, and what's wrong with that? But there's still some part of me that wants to go back to this, like, is it a thing question, right? Like, that I want some kind of satisfying answer, some sort of on-off switch, some sort of like concrete bounded territory that one can point to. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you're not going to get it. You're
Right,
not going to
right,
get
I
that
know.
answer.
Right.
I mean, the thing is, like, it's as if you said, Richard, is there something called depression? Right? Is there something
Right,
called
that's the best analog, yeah.
Anxiety, whatever? I mean, these are things to help drive care, right? And so, the comparison I make is like the color spectrum. Where exactly does yellow become orange
Right.
and orange become red? We don't really know, but we create boundaries there, and sometimes those boundaries can shift. But more specifically, where does shyness become autism, or where does typical sadness become something that's clinical depression?
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the point at which the diagnosis kicks into play. And the reason that autism is in the DSM is because we don't know what causes it. The reason depression is in there is we don't know what causes it, or any of the other hundreds of disorders. In fact, everything in the DSM with only one or two diagnoses is idiopathic or of unknown cause. These are frameworks to make sense. They're approximations, they're guides. They were never intended by physicians or clinicians to be unchangeable. They were intended to be able to guide clinical care, but also to standardize populations in research studies, so that I can know that if I'm studying this group of people and I call them X, and you're studying thousands of miles away another group of people, we actually, our studies can be comparable. We're studying that same group of people. I would hazard to say that many people with autism today would never actually meet the criteria that are stringent and strict for a research protocol. But they have the diagnosis for other reasons.
Right. So to go back to the point you made about the sort of the capaciousness of the category, like, what do you think is the best way in lay terms to tell someone? If someone says, like, I've never heard of this thing called autism, what is it?
Autism is defined as a group, a constellation of co-occurring signs and symptoms that have their onset in early childhood, typically before 36 months, includes stereotyped and repetitive behaviors, sensory sensitivities, difficulties not only developing language, but with social communication, but that this group of symptoms can occur at various different levels of severity and require very many different levels of support. Having said that, autism is not only that group of symptoms, but it is also that group of symptoms if they accompany something that we know to be an identifiably with an identifiable cause. So, for example, autism in the DSM is idiopathic, of unknown origin, of unknown cause. But there are children who have the symptoms of autism who have Down syndrome, or who have tuberous sclerosis, or Fragile X, or some other kind of genetic framework that gives them the symptoms of autism. And in those cases, you have a very different type of person with autism. And it's sometimes called syndromal autism because it's autism associated with a syndrome. But if we knew what caused autism, it would come out of the DSM.
As a cultural anthropologist and as the father of a child with an autism diagnosis, how do you understand this kind of moment of discourse around it, and the kind of what seems among a certain segment of the population, but not a small one, this kind of obsession with this idea that it's growing and that the growing nature of it is a real threat and ominous and a cause for concern and necessitates finding some sort of smoking gun cause that can then be addressed to then reduce incidences of it?
Well, I guess that the thing that I do is I look at history, and I see there are moments of time where doctors are really freaked out that there's an epidemic of something. You could go to Paris in the 1700s, where at some points nearly 1% of the population is confined in an asylum. There's a fear of mass insanity. You can go to World War I, where there's a fear of an epidemic of weak, fragile men who are getting shell shock, or of people getting post-traumatic stress disorder in subsequent wars. At the end of World War II, there was such a concern that there was an epidemic of trauma that Harry Truman says to the Army, "You have this classification of diseases, of mental illnesses. Can you make something for the general population?" And so they take Army 203, Medical 203, which was an Army document, and they turn that into the first DSM. So it's originally a military document. And then Harry Truman starts the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. And the purpose, the real mandate of NIMH was to find out what happened in World War II to cause all this mental illness. So there are various points.
I somehow did not know that story. That's wild.
Yeah, I mean, there are just many points in time in which there seem to be these fears of something that is an epidemic, because we start to name it and we start to see it, and it becomes more visible. The more visible something is, the more we think that it's ubiquitous and that it's everywhere. And then, like, all of a sudden, one day you wake up and you say, "Well, look, it's all around me. How did I not notice it before? I don't remember seeing any kids with autism when I was growing up."
I mean, they literally say that this is a common
they literally
line.
Say that, yes.
That over and over again. And I think about the depression analog is very good, because I think about this all the time, where as I got older and I went to therapy and I learned about depression, I learned about anxiety, and I learned about my own relationship to anxiety and the like, that sometimes these moments would snap into focus of your child and be like, "Oh, that relative was depressed." Like, they had classical, like, bright headlight flashing clinical depression signifiers.
Yeah.
That at the time it was like, "Oh, they just, I don't know, they don't like to leave the house," or whatever the description we had for it. And so there's a lot of those penny drop moments. You get as the language develops, but it also comes with that, like, it wasn't like this when I was a kid feeling.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing any kids with autism when I was growing up, but I didn't know the word autism. I knew the term mental retardation. I knew the term emotionally disturbed. And those kids were mostly in institutions, because that's where they could be educated. If they were educated, they were in residential institutions, and they were under other terms. They were not called autistic. When we see autism enter into the public school systems, that's when we see it gain traction and take off. Because there are only 13 terms in the special education system for delivering special education, just 13 labels. And autism comes into that list in the 1991-92 school year, and it takes off from there. And as it grows and grows, other things start to drop.
This is interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, so as parents start to think about autism as something that's not necessarily, a devastating disorder that a kid can't develop from, particularly if they notice that there are kids with autism who are developing language and they're growing and they're changing over time. And kids do that. They change a lot over time. They start to see intellectual disability and mental retardation, which were mental retardation was the term until about 2000. Then it switches to intellectual disability. They start to see that as highly stigmatizing and as evidence of like a fixed condition that can't be changed, right?
A cap. This is an essential cap on who you are and what you can be.
Yeah. So increasingly then too, kids with identifiable genetic disorders are getting diagnoses of autism. They have company. They join a larger group of people. There's more support. The spectrum grows, it becomes a less fearful diagnosis. And so there have been studies, one of the best by a group at Penn State. They showed that from 2000 to 2010, and they looked at the records of about 6 million children per year, that the use of autism classifications in the United States increased dramatically. But 65 to 66% of that increase could be accounted for solely by the decrease in the use of intellectual disability.
Wow.
You add to that
the
decreases in learning disorder and emotional disturbance, and it can account for a lot of that. I mean, here's the thing. The special education rate in the United States and England has been pretty static for the past 20, 25 years at between 13 and 15%. And yet autism's gone up during that time by 330%. So how do you have a 330% increase in autism with a static special education delivery rate? The only way that happens is that you see shifts in diagnosis.
That is really mind-blowing and really useful to understand in that way, because it just gets back to this, like, right, that deep question about naming, right? Like, what are we doing? How are we naming the world? How are we naming what's inside of us? How are we naming behaviors? And that point you made about stigma is really interesting to me, right? Because it is true, again, if I go back and think about like mental retardation or intellectual disability, and the classification that entailed and the stigma and the kind of, and the sense of what that meant as opposed to the sense of autism, like the latter is more expansive and variegated. And, the richest man in the world, says he's on the spectrum and has an Asperger's diagnosis, I believe. So it's like, you could be anything. You could be wildly successful, or you could not, or just like anyone else can be, as opposed to our understanding of what that category that we used those words for before really was profoundly limiting.
Autism it was not available. You couldn't be autistic. People think that there are a lot more gay people today. Being gay wasn't available in the past. It wasn't an option. Changing your gender, that was not an option.
Right.
Autism is available today. It's an option, and it's good as long as we don't use it to demean, and to stigmatize. But as we've said, it's become such an expansive term that there are groups that now think we should go back and make some more subtypes, like profound autism.
And what is the thinking behind that?
The thinking behind that is that the kids with real needs, real heavy support needs, like, need to live in residential institutions maybe for the rest of their lives, that they're getting lost in this conversation that somebody with autism can start Tesla, someone with autism can be the president of a university, that when they tell somebody that their child has autism, that they think that automatically people assume that their child's a genius, and that they want to draw attention to the fact that we still need to provide very intensive supports for people who have high support needs because it is such an enormous spectrum, and it's kind of like,
Oh, that's really interesting.
I mean, it's kind of like what we do in anthropology, and not my kind of anthropology, but the other people in my field who do biologic work, where they're always trying to lump or split different species and say, well, maybe we should include all of these people in this category. But then the category becomes so big that they then
Right.
divide it up into smaller categories. And, I guess it comes down to what's useful to help somebody, right? Now, why do people who are 58 or 60 years old now get diagnosed with autism? That's an interesting question too,
Yeah,
right?
that is a quite interesting
I
question.
mean, like, there's no service they can get,
Right.
right? So why do they do it? And they say, finally, for the first time, I understand why I've always felt different, or socially awkward, why I had trouble understanding humor and social cues. And it helps them make sense of themselves. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it doesn't mean that there's an epidemic. It
Right.
means that
Right.
it means we're
Right.
adopting a new framework for understanding ourselves.
What do you think the effect is of the current public discourse coming from very powerful people with enormous platforms, including the President of the United States, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, both in what they're saying about, medical advice, but also just generally the tenor of the conversation and what effect it has?
I think a lot of people feel that when one or two people speak for them, that they're not being represented, and that they're not representing themselves. One of the things that various patient advocacy groups have talked about over the past decades is nothing about us without us. And so when government leaders talk about autism without input from the people who are actually autistic and the families, and cherry pick a few individuals to make a particular case, they're really not representing the diversity of what's out there. And I think we just have to be careful of one or two people having an outsized influence. This often happens in countries where there are maybe not political leaders who dominate health discourse, but there might be a group of doctors or a university in another country where what they say goes. And that can be harmful. I also think that we often see the child being used in media, in political discourse, as a symbol of vulnerability and innocence.
Totally.
And that's, easy to exploit that, right? So there have been anti-vaccine movements since the late 1700s, when the first smallpox vaccine was introduced. And probably the most robust anti-vaccine movement in history was the second half of the 19th century in England. And the discourse was framed all about the innocent child. This was the innocent, vulnerable child. And this was a discourse that was replacing the Calvinist idea that children were born tainted by original sin, that every child was pure. And so if you vaccinated a child, you not only harmed the integrity of their body, but you harmed the integrity of their soul. The British vaccinated against their will British Indians in the British colonies. Americans vaccinated against their will Mexican nationals in the early 20th century who came across the border. There was a huge anti-vaccine movement in the early 1900s in Brazil because poor people believed the government was trying to eradicate them. So anti-vaccine movements are nothing new. But more fundamentally, what's not new is the way in which the child becomes this symbol of purity and vulnerability. And that takes on a special power with autism because of the coincidental link between the age at which autism emerges and when the majority of the vaccines are given. That relationship is coincidental, not causal. but it looks causal to people because it happens at the same time. And so you see these things happening over and over again in history. And I don't want to say this is just old wine in new bottles, but to some extent, we've seen this story before if you look back in history.
You know, I'm glad you went down this road, because I sometimes wonder, like, oh, was that one Lancet article just like this, like Mrs. O'Leary's cow in the Chicago fire? Like just a kind of bad accident that just ended up having catastrophic consequences.
Well,
and if the cow
yeah.
hadn't, you know, or
Here, let me quote here Mark Twain at the risk of saying a cliche quote, which is that lies can get halfway around the world
Right.
before truth even gets its shoes on.
Right.
It's really hard to correct those things.
But what I'm hearing from you is that it's both that feature of how misinformation can spread, but that there's deep cultural structures beneath it, like skepticism about vaccines or worries about vaccines because vaccination is given to children, particularly because children, I mean, any parent who's gone to take their kid to get vaccinated, as I have with all three of mine, it's like, it's a rough scene in there. They're, your little baby's getting a shot and it sucks and they cry and you feel bad. And so when you take that, which is like, this feels wrong, you're sticking my child with a needle, that kind of thing, with the science about this is a little remote, or sometimes in some of the cases you cited is being promulgated by authorities that are actively hostile to me and people like me, and therefore I have very good reason not to trust them. And then that last thing about the sort of coincidental timing of it, that there's just like a deep set of reasons that this cultural obsession has grown up over and above one article published by The Lancet.
Yeah, and I think parents are vulnerable. When you take your child to the pediatrician, you're not just going and taking your child to the pediatrician. You're going there as a parent who's probably just anxious, being a new parent, right?
Yeah,
Am I doing something wrong?
Absolutely.
Am I doing something wrong? And that's the difficulty when people exploit that vulnerability. And then you rack your brain. So let's just talk about my daughter for a minute. My wife and I consider ourselves to be, highly educated, reasonable people. And I kept saying, was it maybe that roller coaster ride? Was it maybe that, remember we were finishing our floors in our new house?
Right.
Could
totally.
it be that chemical or whatever? There's this, there's something there. You're looking for reasons. And the truth of the rise of autism as a diagnosis, not the symptoms, but the diagnosis of autism, and the truth about what causes the whole autism spectrum isn't satisfying if you're looking for a single cause and effect, because you got to go into, well, there are more child psychiatrists now, and we've improved our special education, and they broadened the criteria, and families aren't living in groups like they used to in rural areas where there was more social support, and we're counting cases better, and on and on and on, and all of those things are what act in concert, but the single bullet, the magic bullet is so seductive.
Do you think that all the developments you've described that have kind of been coincident with and facilitated the rise in diagnoses, the growth of child psychiatrists, special education and laws and regulations that, determine IEPs, independent educational plans for children that qualify, a more capacious and nuanced understanding of how autism can manifest. Do you think, taken together, it's been a set of good developments for people with autism? Like, are we doing better now? Are we progressing?
Yeah, I think that autism has kind of led the way for other things too. I mean, yes, it's better definitely the world is a better place for people with autism. You can get jobs. You can get an education. You can explain yourself. You can understand yourself, describe yourself to others. You have, managers of movie theaters doing sensory friendly movie nights. But when my daughter was having a tantrum at the age of 3 and people didn't know about autism, and I tried to explain to somebody in a Target or a Costco that she was having a tantrum because she had autism, it didn't mean anything to them. It means something to people. The real development, and I think autism was at the forefront of this, is providing people a way to get support. I will always remember a couple of years ago, I was teaching a freshman class. I don't usually do that, but occasionally I'll teach just a group of freshmen. And I just wanted to know how things were going at the university. And I said, can you just tell me, at the end of this semester, your first semester here, like, what's the best thing that happened? Was it a class or, an event? And one woman said, oh, the best thing that happened to me this whole semester was I got diagnosed with ADHD. And I was like, well, why is that good? How is that the best thing? And she said, I always knew I needed support, but my parents told me I was just lazy. My parents told me I wasn't smart enough, or maybe I wasn't working hard enough, or just didn't have natural intelligence. And I got here and I finally took it into my own hands and I went to see a psychologist and I got diagnosed with ADHD. And it was the first time somebody looked at me and didn't see me as lazy or stupid and saw me as somebody who just needed a few accommodations to succeed. I mean, that was so powerful, right? And what just so remarkable to me as a social scientist and as an educator and as a dad is how we've gotten to the point where people can come out and be open and say, even in a class of 200, 300 kids, well, as someone with ADHD or as someone with autism or as somebody who suffered from PTSD due to childhood trauma, I mean, that takes strength, right?
Yeah.
That takes classifications that have been disarmed from their power to stigmatize. And it takes a society that is open to understanding that these people are not weird, they are normal, that we all are somewhere on some spectrum. Sorry, I'm getting exercised about this because it really is something that's deeply emotional to me.
Well, it is, and it's very, the way you're articulating it is very profound and moving to me as well. And it also, to me, kind of puts on the table the backlash. I mean, I think, you referenced trans folks a second ago, because I think there's a lot of similarities here, right? Like, is it real? Why are people doing this now? We didn't have this in my day. Like, oh, you just say this thing about yourself and then everyone in the world is supposed to treat you that way and make accommodations for you. Like, it's all the same, the kind of this sort of reactionary feeling about it. Again, to quote a phrase, is on a spectrum across these different ways that people may come to know themselves, right? Or name what they are, whether that's a name they give themselves or a name that we sort of arrive at socially and through medical systems as well. And so, there's like, I think about my beloved deceased grandfather, who was a very, very stoic Catholic conservative guy who was wonderful guy, but he was just like, he didn't like people complaining, he didn't like people like drawing too much attention to themselves, it's whining. Like, there is this kind of, I do think you see in the language that's emanating from some parts of the president and stuff across a range of issues, a reaction to precisely the thing that you're naming as liberatory, right? Like, that is exactly the thing they don't like. Like, everybody's got a diagnosis every day, every way, and everyone needs an accommodation, and everyone's got something wrong with them, and I'm suddenly a girl, or I'm suddenly have autism, and that's exactly the thing that there is genuine backlash to.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative to that is we just tell people to suffer, to suffer, right? Yeah. And that's not something that we want to do. I mean, yes, to be honest with you, I'm sure there are people out there that game the system and, they try to get more accommodations for this or that. But I think that's rare. I think mostly you have people who are suffering, and we have created the conditions for them to get some care for that suffering. I wouldn't want it otherwise. And, today, we look at things as sometimes people look at things as negative, right? So let's say we see that, as has happened in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's autism monitoring, that there are, that it used to be that there were many fewer black children with autism than white children. And then we see the autism prevalence rate increasing among black children. And we assume that that's a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at the history of black children's education, we find that they were frequently diagnosed with conditions like conduct disorder or emotional disturbance, while the white counterparts with the exact same symptom profile were getting autism diagnoses. So it could be that this increase in rates among minority children is that minority children are getting services now that were denied to them in the past. Now, the CDC says that gap is narrowed now, and we don't see that distinction. But hidden within those data are still disparities, where there appears to be an overemphasis on diagnosing black children with autism who have intellectual disability rather than average and above average intelligence. And kids are getting diagnosed or at least ascertained by the CDC researchers by abstracting from their symptoms to autism, but they may not have a diagnosis of autism from a doctor or from the school itself. And so those disparities can still exist. So my point is that it's very nuanced, and what we can see as what one person sees as epidemic, another person sees as progress.
Right, exactly. Like the headline, rise in autism among black children, right? You could read that and think, well, that's not good, right? Or that seems ominous, you know? Or you could read that and say like, oh, to your point with the context here is that like, if you think about the diagnosis as embedded in a set of institutions in which the diagnosis unlocks forms of support that people were previously locked out of, then that's actually an encouraging development.
Absolutely. Take my daughter, for example. So she doesn't appear as a case of autism anywhere in the school records until the 5th grade. Why? Because if she had been classified in the school system as autistic, she would have had to go to a school 20 miles away. We wanted her to grow up in our neighborhood, across the street from other kids who went to the same school, to go to the same parks after school and play on the slides. And in order to do that, she had to go to our home school, which didn't have an autism program. So she was educated for most of her elementary school under the classification of multiple disabilities. She doesn't appear as a case of autism until later. So that moment when she does appear as a case of autism is a good one, right? Because that's when we had more teachers who had more specialized training, where there was greater understanding of how to help kids with autism perform and develop academically. And if we look at South Korea, before we did our epidemiologic study, they weren't screening in the school systems for autism. Now they are. And now autism is a very common diagnosis. Did we cause it? No. But we said, look, if you look at these kids and you use this framework that's being developed, you will see that these kids have autism, and you will have a new way of looking at them. You can see them differently.
I'm curious about your own personal experience as a parent, because you do talk about it. You talk about it in the op-ed and in other places.
And my daughter loves it, by the way, when I do talk about her.
That's good. Yeah.
She likes it. She feels important.
Well, I guess one question I have is like just the trajectory of this story as a parent, of what you've seen, just about the way that parents talk about it and the commonality. I can say for, my cohort, it's just very common and very almost, I wouldn't quite say it's like saying a kid's left-handed, but it's not that far from it in certain circles of like, this is a thing about my kid, and it has been fairly destigmatized, but I'm a little younger, and I wonder like how you've experienced that trajectory.
Yeah, I have seen just such, a remarkable change in people kind of appreciating what someone can do. It's not like the person with autism is appreciated only if they go to an Ivy League school or a 4-year college, but appreciating people with autism who are contributing and building meaningful lives. Like, I mean, I remember talking to people early on in the 2000s, who parents who were just so dissatisfied that their child was working, say, bagging groceries at a grocery store. But today, people are talking about it differently. They're saying, "Oh, my child loves working at the grocery store. She makes perfectly fine, she makes
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
She loves the people. She loves the repetition. She's good at it." So I think that
Yeah.
there's something different going on, which is that I hope, at least. I mean, maybe this is just me pretending that this is true because I want it to be true, but that we're valuing people in different ways for what they can do, and not just making an assumption that there's this set of things we have to conform to. Living independently, like you have to do that. Supporting yourself entirely, being the autonomous, individual that we idealize in capitalist societies. To what I think is happening with autism is we're realizing that what is natural is not to be independent and autonomous and conforming. What is natural is that to be human means to be dependent and to be interdependent. And yes, my daughter will live with me for who knows how long, but is that wrong? And yet every parent I meet says, "Will your child be able to live independently?" I'm like, why? Why would she have to?
Right.
Why would that be a thing that she would have to do? In what society? Well, maybe this society. But go to the places that I've done work in sub-Saharan Africa. The idea that the ideal child leaves the family and lives autonomously and independently is just bizarre, right? So one of the things that we need to do is shift our values, shift the way we're thinking about what constitutes a meaningful life.
Richard Grinker is a cultural anthropologist. He's director of the George Washington University Institute for Ethnographic Research. He's the author of numerous books, including Unstrange Minds, Remapping the World of Autism. And you can read a great op-ed he wrote about some of the recent discourse around autism called Autism Has Always Existed. We haven't always called it autism. That was really, really a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.